Hello again, Tony Wright, FLCC AB Wright Ministries. It's still a 90-day Bible study, and we're still in day number 63. This happens to be part 2. We're in the book of Daniel. Now remember yesterday when we left off of part 1, I'll say, Daniel was busy breaking the code on the dreams for King Nebuchadnezzar. But Daniel was able to come through for King Nebuchadnezzar, remember, because God continued to come through for Daniel. And so now, here we are, part 2, still in Daniel. Now, after Nebuchadnezzar's reign, there was another king later by the name of Belshazzar. You see that? Belshazzar. Yeah, this is the king, though, Belshazzar. And he threw a feast one day. And as the Bible says, he drank wine with the thousands that were there, and that Belshazzar tasted the wine. Well, what this actually means is that when Belshazzar began to feel the influence of the wine, the king was a little tipsy. And now he gave orders for the temple vessels, which King Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem, and that they be brought to the banquet hall with his toasted little behind. Boy, next thing you know, this feast came to a screeching halt when somebody noticed the fingers of a man's hand just come out of thin air, and the fingers start to write on the wall plaster across from this huge lamp stand. Oh my goodness. Boy, when the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing, it scared the bejeebers out of him. You hear me? His face turned pale. His knees started knocking. This dude fell apart. So then he called out for his wise men. Yeah, they couldn't read that writing. Then the queen, she remembered Daniel. So they called him in. Boy, have you ever heard the phrase, he could read the writing on the wall? So finally, Daniel was brought in before the king. And the king repeated the promise about the rewards that he would give to whoever, could explain this mysterious writing that he had made to his wise men. But Daniel, he told the king that he wasn't at all interested in his rewards. He said that the gift of prophecy, not for sale. Daniel reminded the king of what God had done for and done to King Nebuchadnezzar. And he boldly rebuked Belshazzar because he had offended God so grievously that he had sent forth this hand to write this inscription on the wall in the first place. So the ominous words on the wall were mene, tekel, and peres, which roughly translated to the words that mean numbered, weighed, and divided. Boy, Belshazzar had to be a little bit shaken up by Daniel's explanation of what these words meant. But he fulfilled the commitment which he had made to Daniel. And Daniel was dressed in purple, and a gold necklace was placed around his neck. And the king issued a proclamation naming Daniel as the third ruler in the kingdom. But that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So then Darius the Mede received the kingdom. Now Darius, he quickly organized the kingdom into this 2-tier bureaucracy. It had 120 provincial governors who were accountable to those 3 commissioners, of which Daniel was the lead one. Now, just as he had done during this Chaldean kingdom, the prophet, he began to distinguish himself, and other leaders were jealous that a Jew was a top administrator over the kingdom. So, of course, they began to, try to figure out some ways and some grounds that they might be able to find fault in Daniel. So the officers, they devised this plan where they would persuade the king to proclaim himself as a sole representative of the deity for a period of 30 days. Now, that wasn't that unusual for that period of time in that place, because a lot of kings kind of thought of themselves as a god and a king anyway. So this suggestion appealed to the ego of this new king, and he signed the document that they had prepared. And of course, once he signed it, it became irrevocable. Now, Daniel knew that the document had been signed, but that didn't change his prayer habits. So these enemies of Daniel, they made their accusation to King Darius, and Darius was pretty distressed at the report that they gave him, because he realized he had been used as part of this vendetta against his best subordinate. Now, he wanted to avoid punishing Daniel for this entrapment that they had set him up for, but then they reminded the king that no statute that had been established by the king could just be rescinded or altered. So Darius was forced to either take action against Daniel or lose his crown, possibly even lose his own life. So the prophet, he was thrown into this den of lions. Now the king called to Daniel. He said, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Now, as early as possible the next morning, Darius, he rushed to this lion's den. And as he approached the place, he cried out, or he screamed out, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve constantly, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Now, even King Darius, he recognized that Daniel's God, he recognized him as a living God, in contrast to these idols which they were so prone to worship all over the land. Now, because of this lion's den experience, though, Darius, he had reached the same conclusion about Daniel's God as Nebuchadnezzar had before him. But unfortunately, this king had also made the same mistake as this Chaldean ruler earlier, Nebuchadnezzar, had done. He thought that he'd be able to legislate allegiance to the Lord. Now, a decree was sent out throughout his whole realm, and an edict was ordered that all men were to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. So Darius was trying to undo, some of the effects of his previous edict where he had issued, but this was just as wrong-headed, just as torqued up as the previous one. Now, men, they got to be free to choose whether or not they're going to bow before the living God. So in his edict, Darius, he didn't rise above the level of any other polytheist, right? He didn't confess that Daniel's God was to be the only true God. He just tried to elevate him above all the other gods. Darius cited 4 reasons, though, for requiring his subjects to recognize the God of Daniel. First, he said Daniel's God was the living God, that he was active in the affairs of the men right there where they were living. And second, he said that the eternal God, he was the eternal God, and his reign would never be destroyed. And he said that Daniel's God delivers and rescues, for he delivered his servant from the power of these lions. And then finally, he said that Daniel's God performed signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Now, Daniel, he did pretty well during the time of this Medo-Persian Empire, especially after this lion's den incident. And he enjoyed a lot of success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now, the form of the last 6 chapters in Daniel, though, they contrast pretty sharply with the first 6. Now, while the first half of the book focused pretty much on historical incidents, the last 6 chapters, they focus on visions and prayers. Now, there's no mention of Daniel's friends and the monarchs. They're only mentioned to help date material in the last half of this book of Daniel. There's no mention made of Babylon's wise men in the last half of this book. Here, in these last 6 chapters, God is speaking through prophecy. And Daniel was first given a glimpse of the future. And in the vivid, terrifying symbolism, he saw what was going to unfold on the stage of history. Daniel saw 4 different beasts coming from the sea. They represented the great world empires of history. The 4 beasts represented the sum total of all the power that the world would produce in the course of that development. And the angel told Daniel that the 4 beasts represented the 4 kings that would arise from the earth. Now, in prophecy, the terms kings and kingdoms, they're used pretty interchangeably. But the 4 beasts would arise from the earth. Now, these worldly kingdoms, they were only going to be temporary, though. It said the saints of the highest one would receive a kingdom that was permanent. That's God's people. So the angel introduced those who would be citizens of that kingdom, which would be given to the one like unto the Son of Man. And he called them saints, those that were separated from the world. Get separated. Now, they're the true people of God, whether the Jews or Gentiles, separated for God's purpose. Ultimately, though, God's people would win the victory over all these opposing forces. Now, Daniel's second vision, kind of like the first, used animal symbolism. And in that vision, Daniel saw a ram and a he-goat clash. And then another little horn appeared. In the end, though, the animal symbolism was dropped. And Daniel, he described the persecution of God's people and the desecration of the holy temple of God's people. And Daniel, he explained that symbolism of the ram and the he-goat. He said the ram with its uneven horns, it represented the kings of Media and Persia. And the shaggy goat represented the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn of the goat, it represented the first king of the kingdom of Greece, meaning Alexander the Great. And then the four horns, which arose after the large horn was broken, represented four kingdoms that would arise from that kingdom, which had been ruled by Alexander the Great. Now, for the Jews, the two most important of those four kingdoms, though, were the Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt, and the Seleucids, who ruled Syria and the Mesopotamia area. Now, the little horn that came out of one of the four horns of the goat represented the king who would arise. And during the reign of Antiochus, the Roman, they began to assert themselves throughout that Mediterranean world. And the Greek kingdoms entered a period of decline during that same time. And Gabriel identified the time of the rise of the evil king as being when the transgressors have run their course, meaning they have become as wicked as they could become. Boy, tell me something. Now, under these Ptolemies and the Seleucids, the Jews were exposed to Hellenism, which is an intensive promotion of the Greek ways and thoughts. Now, during this period, Antiochus, he came on the scene. Oh, and I bet you'll never guess who is leaving the scene right about now. Yep, me. But I'll be back. Until then, though, you keep reading this word, you keep checking us out on social media, and please tell your friends and tell your neighbors that FLCC, we caught the vision, baby, and we're taking ministry back to the first love. Peace.